Hello, my sweet friends. How I miss you when we haven't spoken. Ever since Season 4 came out, my viewers have been asking me to do a guide on Kunimitsu, and I never promised I would. For me, that kind of depends on how I feel about a character, about the balance, about the design. But you know what? What the hell? Let's just do it. So, without any further introing, this is my full guide for how to play Kunimitsu in Tekken 7 Season 4. If your opponent is good, don't throw daggers. If your opponent is bad, constantly throw daggers. Manually go into stance and mix this low with this mid. If either move counter hits, you win the round. If the low scores a normal hit instead of a counter hit, remain in crouch and mix this low with this mid. Whenever your opponent is knocked to the ground, collect a giant chunk of free damage with 442. Don't forget to put the character in a creepy bikini even though she's like 6 years old. I hope you enjoyed the guide, everybody. I enjoyed making it. I feel like it might have been the most complete description of a character's playstyle that I've ever given, but I'm looking at the time and we have some left, so what do you say we hang out for a while and talk about something a little bit more interesting? I haven't played Tekken 7 for almost 2 weeks, which is very rare for me. Shadowlands came out and I've been busy tanking mythics on my Brewmaster, if that means anything to you. It's been so much fun, but I finished everything I wanted to do for this reset, and so inevitably I start sinking back into Tekken. It's like gravity, it's like coming home. I went online and apparently people have been debating guest characters this week because of some stupid shit that happened on social media. Luckily I don't really have social media, so I don't have to worry about that kind of thing, but I thought it was an interesting question to think about, guest characters. My immediate thought was, there are so many of them in this game, but then I looked at the roster and realized there are only really 4, and they're all very distinct from one another. Guest characters are also a new concept in Tekken. The only one I can think of from the past is Gon, that weird little dinosaur thing that's from like a comic book or something. But even though they are a new thing, I have no doubt that guest characters are here to stay because they've already proven to be extremely effective marketing tools. So I wanted to sort of build an opinion on what it's meant for this game. I went into practice mode, I went through move lists and old patch notes and tournament footage, and I wanted to share some of my thoughts here. I remember playing Tekken at the Hakata Bus Terminal Game Center the day Akuma became available. It was such a crazy day. People were going mad, throwing snacks in the air. Most of us were gathered around this one machine where a guy who was also a Street Fighter player was showing everybody the things he'd found that you could do with the EX cancels and the fireballs. Everybody was so excited, but I had this terrible sinking feeling in my chest. I was almost depressed. If you follow my content, you know that I am completely disinterested in 2D fighting games and I don't like zoning, so I definitely didn't want Tekken to start turning into Street Fighter, especially not if it was going to bring really bad balance. Now we knew within minutes that this character was completely broken and had to be nerfed, and then he was nerfed, but we just kept finding more stuff and they had to keep nerfing. I think they nerfed him something like 5 or 6 times in just a couple of months, but what we couldn't have known back then is 5 years later we are in Tekken 7 on home console in its 4th season and Akuma still isn't balanced. I think it's pretty obvious at this point that they made something they didn't really understand and that they don't really know what to do with. But then again, maybe that's inevitable when you take a character from a completely different franchise and allow it to retain all of its mechanics from that other franchise. It's not necessarily a great idea to just splice very different fighting games together, especially when they don't even have the same number of spatial dimensions. Now with Akuma, people talk about fireballs, they talk about EX moves. My personal favorite example is the demon flip. This is something iconic that Akuma does in Street Fighter, brackets apparently, but you could have had this be just the way it looks when Akuma jumps into the air. It didn't have to be significant in terms of gameplay to satisfy people who want this to have a superficial connection to what the character is in Street Fighter. Instead, they made it a stance that crushes highs by going over them and then comes down with completely inescapable mix-ups. They also gave him better standard tools than most standard Tekken characters, and I haven't even started talking about the combo damage. I think with Akuma, you're in a situation where you can't really fix it if all you're willing to do is fuck with numbers, change frame data and change damage. It's kind of a situation where you have to go back to the drawing board, and that's very difficult to do when you've opened Pandora's box and put a character in the game. Now you're busy developing whatever content you want to put into the game next, so you kind of keep putting band-aids on this very large wound, and then you look in a different direction because all the blood is making you squeamish. This is a screenshot of an old video of mine. I watched it back today and it was very embarrassing. It's a mystery to me how I ever got any subscribers on YouTube, but it's my initial impressions of Noctis when we saw the first trailer for him. And watching this trailer, I was like desperately looking around for different mechanics or meter burns that he would be bringing with him from Final Fantasy, and I didn't find any, and that made me very happy. If you look at my description, I write that I think it looks pretty great, and the reason I felt like that was it looked like they were doing the opposite of what they did with Akuma. They didn't take a game that I like less than Tekken and put it into Tekken. They took a character from a different game and brought Tekken to it, and I've always felt like that's the right way to do it. So why don't they? Well, my guess is that it doesn't make sense from a marketing perspective. If you're trying to make Street Fighter players play Tekken instead, then they probably have to recognize Akuma in this game. But then again, does that make sense in a long-term perspective? If you love Street Fighter that much, which game are you more likely to play? The game that has one Street Fighter character or the one that has 50? The one called Street Fighter. So yeah, I was really positive about Noctis leading up to his release, despite the fact that he looked and sounded like a little bitch. Then he came out, turns out he is a little bitch, but that has nothing to do with him being from a different game. This is very much a Tekken character, just a very cheap and annoying one, and that has to do with the trifecta between down back 1+2, down back 2, and running 1+2. If you didn't have those moves, I might actually really like this design. He also has one of my favorite design decisions that they've made with any character in this game. I've said it many times before, but I absolutely love the way they designed his projectile. I think it's kind of genius. Like I said earlier, I'm not a fan of zoning in fighting games, but Noctis' shift break, when it gets blocked, it forces him to teleport in at a disadvantage, giving up his turn, but also giving up all the space between him and the opponent. And that means that you cannot use this projectile for zoning. You can't stand on one side of the stage and just keep on doing it. And I think that works perfectly. So Noctis made me hopeful. There is a way of taking a character from a completely different game and allowing them to be what they are supposed to aesthetically and still making them very Tekken. And to me, he's kind of the anti-Akuma, and I really appreciated that about him. Now, if Noctis is an indication that a guest character can have really cool design, I think that Negan is proof positive. This is not only my favorite guest character, in Season 4 at least, it's one of my favorite character designs in the entire game. For the first period of time we had him, he was kind of annoying and felt incomplete, and there's still some uncanny valley stuff going on with the face, but in Season 4 I think this character is really fun to use. I think he feels reasonable and balanced to play against, and he also manages to feel very Tekken. It's important to emphasize when I say that, I don't mean that I would like all the characters in the game to be the same, have similar moves, but if you're going to try to innovate, you should probably do it within the confines of what makes Tekken great, and I think Negan manages to do that. It's an interesting question, how do you make a traditional Tekken character who fights using a bat? And there's no reason that character has to come from a TV show about zombies either. You could make an original Tekken character, I don't know, Sudoku Mishima, the disgraced nephew of Heihachi. Maybe he wanted to be a professional baseball player, but then he fell from grace, became an enforcer for the mob, and now he walks around killing people with a baseball bat. I think that's a design I would be happy to have. I honestly hope they do something like that going forward, because I like this design enough that I would be really sad to see it go, despite it being a strange guest inclusion from a TV show that I've never seen. I mean, think about these three characters. For example, we have Eliza, who's an original Tekken character made specifically for this franchise with fan input even, and for strange reasons I can't go into here, she borrows her gameplay mechanics from a different franchise, specifically Street Fighter, and she's been a nightmare to balance properly, even though she was never as broken as Akuma. And then we have Fakum Lam, another original Tekken character who doesn't borrow mechanics from anywhere, but he manages to be cancerous anyway because of bad balancing choices. And then we have Negan, a really strange and out there guest inclusion who somehow manages to be more balanced and more Tekken than the other two put together. And it just makes me feel like whether or not a character is a guest is completely arbitrary. It just comes down to good or bad design. So saying that guest characters shouldn't be in the game doesn't make sense to me because it doesn't really have much to do with that. But saying that they're a good thing because they create hype and sell copies of the game isn't really right either, in my opinion. As you know, these days I'm very suspicious of hype and the manufacture of hype. Hype flares up very quickly, but then it dies down permanently, and we're just left with the design decisions of the people who make the game. Guest characters are definitely staying for the future because they help to sell copies of the game, and that is the most important thing to the people who make the decisions. But I think the lesson to learn from Tekken 7 and its guest inclusions is that you have to retain the soul of what makes Tekken special, and you have to have good balance in your roster. If you're going to innovate, you probably want to do it in a way where you can backpedal on the design if it turns out you have to, whether it's the broken mechanics of Akuma and Elisa or the broken size of Fakum Lam's hurt box. And keep Street Fighter the fuck away from Tekken. Two players moving on a 2D plane, bouncing balls back and forth. It's not a fighting game, it's Pong, and that wasn't fun even when it was new. Thank you so much for watching this. It's great to be back making videos. I'll see you guys in the next one.